In all, the federal response in the nation's capital on June 1st results in multiple injuries and 54 arrests in under 120 minutes. Several days after government forces attack on civilians in Lafayette Square, CNN reports that President Trump has shared a letter on Twitter that refers to the peaceful protesters who were forcibly dispersed from a park near the White House as terrorists. Consistent with this startling misnomer, Politico reports that at one point during the Floyd protests, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper referred to domestic protest areas as battle spaces, a suggestion that U.S. soil either already is or could soon become a site for military engagements and in-theater scenario planning. According to Bloomberg News reporter Jennifer Jacobs, when Esper, under fire for his comment, thereafter says at a news conference that he opposes deploying active-duty troops to contain protests, Trump considers firing him, privately asking advisers if they think Esper can still be an effective defense secretary. Jacobs explains that Esper's remarks about not using the U.S. military against American civilians angered White House officials and Trump personally, and were perceived as the secretary breaking rank because Trump didn't want Esper publicly ruling out what by all accounts would be a historic domestic deployment of the U.S. military. Indeed, in order for the deployment to take place, Trump would have to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. Per the public statement by Esper that drew Trump's ire, the option to use active-duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire situations. We are not in one of those situations now. That the president would contemplate treating widespread anti-police brutality protests as necessitating military force against Americans on U.S. soil is profoundly troubling. But it is not merely unsettling militarism that marks the Trump administration's response to the protests. Another element is deceit, a long-time touchstone of Trump's handling of both media and voters. After falsely claiming that it did not use capsicum spray, pepper spray, in Lafayette Square, the Secret Service admits that it did, and the U.S. Park Police is thereafter caught by Vox in a similar deception. After Trump tells media that federal personnel didn't use either tear gas or rubber bullets on protesters on June 1st, evidence uncovered by reporters reveals not only that they did so, but also that the use of tear gas was personally ordered by Barr. And after Trump falsely claims that he descended into the White House's underground bunker on May 29th merely to conduct an exceedingly brief daytime inspection of it, an Associated Press report reveals that he in fact went to the bunker for nearly an hour at night and, in the view of White House personnel, for his own safety, that is, as part of the Trump administration's seeming overreaction to the largely peaceful demonstrations then happening outside the White House and across the country. Indeed, at one point during the protests, the White House is forced to delete a tweet that falsely identifies a Los Angeles synagogue's homemade, rock-filled anti-terrorism barrier as the work of Antifa and professional anarchists who are purportedly staging bricks for subsequent looting or acts of violence. The Washington Post deems the misleading video in the administration's original tweet a whopper, attaching to it 4 Pinocchios, the newspaper's highest rating for dishonesty. On June 4, 2020, CNN reports that most of the crimes occurring in areas with large-scale anti-police brutality protests are in fact being committed by caravans of well-coordinated, sophisticated burglars employing messaging apps during their heists and using both the protests and other tactics to throw police off their trail. Per CNN, police say that the level of planning behind the high-yield burglaries they encounter during the late May and early June protests suggests, if not the involvement of mafia and organized crime, at a minimum, teams of professional criminals acting with premeditation and significant organization. Reporting from around the country will appear to confirm that much of the violence provoked by Floyd's death emanates from individuals associated with the right wing of American politics. In North Carolina, a man threatens to burn down a black church on June 7th, telling two churchgoers, "You N-words need to shut up." In Maryland, a man is arrested for assaulting 3 people posting Black Lives Matter flyers on a bike path. In Virginia, Harry Rogers, according to local prosecutors, an admitted leader of the Ku Klux Klan and a propagandist for Confederate ideology, is arrested and charged with attempted malicious wounding, felony vandalism, and assault and battery after he allegedly drives his car into a crowd of protesters. Disturbingly, many of the most violent and transgressive incidents attendant upon the protests are initiated by police officers. According to a CNN report, 6 Atlanta police officers are criminally charged after allegedly using excessive force on 2 college students who, while picking up food for dinner, got caught in traffic caused by the protests over the killing of George Floyd. In California, at least 7 Los Angeles police officers are removed from field duties after using excessive force during the protests, according to CNN. A 16-year-old in the Bronx is, per a New York Times report, bruised, shocked with a stun gun, and given a bloody laceration from his cheek to his chin while being arrested during a protest, a case the Times reports has become the most recent focus for critics who charge that the New York police have used unnecessary force during the protests. The Times also reports on a man doctors say may be permanently blind in one eye after being shot by a police-wielded pepper spray-loaded paintball gun at a protest in Nebraska. According to CNN, another civilian, journalist Linda Tirado, is permanently blinded by a police-fired foam bullet during the protests in Minneapolis. In California, per the Los Angeles Daily News, officers fired rubber bullets as dozens entered an apartment building seeking refuge with the help of one of the residents. One of the hard rubber bullet rounds struck a homeless man in a wheelchair right above his left eye, drawing blood and a large welt. USA Today reports on a viral video from Minneapolis in which a large patrol of officers enforcing the city's curfew fired paintball rounds at a group of citizens sitting on their front porch in a residential neighborhood. 10 seconds after officers screamed at the residents, "Go inside and get in your house now," an order was issued to light them up, and the residents were fired upon. In Ohio, Republican Governor Mike DeWine removes a member of the Ohio National Guard from his deployment in the nation's capital after it is discovered, per Ana Cabrera of CNN, that he had expressed white supremacist ideology on the Internet prior to his assignment. In Philadelphia, a police officer is arrested and charged with aggravated assault for allegedly beating a Temple University student during the anti-police brutality protests. In Chicago, 13 police officers break into Democratic Congressman Bobby Rush's campaign office during the protests, thereafter, according to Politico, lounging on chairs, drinking coffee, and making popcorn while looters vandalized nearby businesses. Yet the most widely discussed incident involving police violence following Floyd's death is assuredly the alleged assault of Martin Gugino by 2 officers of the Buffalo Police Department. Gugino, a 75-year-old longtime peace activist, is, at the time of his run-in with police, unarmed, a cancer patient, and affiliated with human rights groups, the Western New York Peace Center and Push Buffalo, an affordable housing advocacy group, and the Catholic Worker Movement. As a horrified nation shares images of a seemingly unconscious Gugino bleeding from a head wound on a Buffalo sidewalk while the officers who pushed him and a large number of their peers file past him unconcernedly, Trump takes to Twitter with what the Washington Post calls a deranged conspiracy theory, falsely suggesting that Gugino is an Antifa provocateur who set up police by deliberately falling and injuring himself. Trump adds equally falsely that before falling, Gugino appeared to scan police communications in order to black out their equipment. As the New York Times reports, Trump's conspiracy theory is taken wholesale from the same OAN reporter, Christiane Rose, who had previously accused Hillary Clinton of funding weapons purchases by Antifa activists. According to the Times, Rose is a Russian native who has also worked for Sputnik, a Kremlin-controlled news outlet that has been accused by U.S. intelligence services of contributing to Russia's efforts to interfere in American elections. Trump's would-be defense of their actions notwithstanding, the two Buffalo officers who allegedly injured Gugino are shortly thereafter charged with second-degree assault. Prior to their arrest, RNC national spokeswoman Elizabeth Harrington, apparently seeking to support President Trump's theorizing about Gugino, who now lies in a hospital in serious but stable condition with a brain injury and a fractured skull, links to an article claiming that the peace activist was in fact trying to get punched in the face. Harrington's social media blunder echoes that of Mercedes Schlapp, a senior Trump 2020 campaign advisor who, per reporting by Politico journalist Mark Caputo, during the protests, uses her Twitter account to amplify an encouraging tweet of a video of a Texas man yelling about fucking N-words as he wields a chainsaw to chase away anti-racism demonstrators. The murder of George Floyd at the hands of police is of course not the first incident of a black man being killed by law enforcement under circumstances no one in America could countenance, nor is it the 100th or 1,000th such incident. Following Floyd's death, the #SayTheirNames campaign re-emerges on Twitter, urging Americans of every demographic to learn, repeat, and honor not just the names, but the richly lived lives of the seemingly numberless men, women, and children of color who have been unjustly killed by police. George Floyd's name now joins in the memories of many Americans of conscience, those of Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Sean Monterosa, Jamel Floyd, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Walter Scott, Alton Sterling, Stephen Clark, Delron Small, Freddie Gray, Ezell Ford, Michelle Couzeau, Tanisha Anderson, Natasha McKenna, Betty Jones, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Eric Reason, Dominique Clayton, John Crawford III, Dante Parker, Laquan McDonald, Akai Gurley, Rumaine Brisbane, Jerame Reed, George Mann, Frank Smart, Matthew Ajibade, Tony Robinson, Anthony Hill, Philip White, Eric Harris, Maya Hall, William Chapman II, Alexia Christian, Jordan Davis, Brendan Glenn, Trayvon Martin, Victor Manuel LaRosa, Jonathan Sanders, Joseph Mann, Salvado Ellswood, Albert Joseph Davis, Darius Stewart, Billy Ray Davis, Michael Sabbie, Brian Keith Day, Christian Taylor, Troy Robinson, Sean Bell, Felix Kumi, Ashams Farrow Manley, Keith Harrison McLeod, Junior Prosper, Kenny Watkins, Lamontez Jones, Patterson Brown, Dominic Hutchinson, Anthony Ashford, Alonzo Smith, Tyree Crawford, India Kager, Levante Biggs, Michael Lee Marshall, Sterling Higgins, Jamar Clark, Shelley Frey, Richard Perkins, Nathaniel Harris Pickett, Benny Lee Tigner, Miguel Espinal, Michael Noel, Kevin Matthews, Quintonio Legrier, Drejon Reed, Keith Childress Jr., Janet Wilson, Randy Nelson, Eula Love, Antrony Scott, Wendell Celestine, David Joseph, Callan Roquemore, Dijon Perkins, Christopher Davis, Marco Loud, Peter Gaines, Torrey Robinson, Kevin Hicks, Christopher McCorvey, Mary Truxillo, DeMarcus Semmer, Willie Tillman, Terrell Thomas, Seville Smith, Terrence Crutcher, Miriam Carey, Darius Robinson, Paul O'Neill, Alteria Woods, Jordan Edwards, Aaron Bailey, Ronell Foster, Antoine Rose II, Pamela Turner, Christopher Whitfield, Michael Lorenzo Dean, Oscar Grant, Stephen Taylor, Corinne Gaines, Yvette Smith, Riddell Jones, Tony McDade, Nicholas Chavez, Freddie Blue, Roy Nelson, Tiara Thomas, Brandon Jones, Bernard Moore, Rayshard Brooks, Danquiers Franklin, Samuel Dubose, Amadou Diallo, and countless others whose names and lives deserve to be discussed and honored with not just a renewed moral commitment to oppose racism and fascism, but ardent anti-racist and anti-fascist activism. The families of these men, women, and children deserve to see Americans of every complexion and experience speak out against the protocols, practices, and systemic racism that contributed to the tragedies their loved ones suffered, tragedies that America has too long abided. Some of these Americans were sitting in their homes when they were killed by police. Others were engaged in everyday activities like babysitting, buying groceries, eating out, driving, shopping for gifts, or spending time with friends. Some were sleeping, but all are dishonored when, as Donald Trump did on June 12th, a U.S. president says of the chokehold, an often prohibited law enforcement maneuver that ended the lives of some of those named earlier, that the concept of the chokehold sounds so innocent, so perfect, and that we have some real bad people in America. You saw that during the last couple of weeks of protests, and you get somebody in a chokehold. And what are you going to do now? Let go and say, oh, let's start all over again. I'm not allowed to have you in a chokehold. It's a tough situation for the police. The dignity of the families of those killed in incidents of police brutality is likewise assailed when the president reverently, almost gleefully, describes the Minnesota National Guard dispersing Minneapolis protesters as being like a knife cutting through butter, right through. And yes, there was probably some tear gas and some other things, but the crowd dispersed, and the Guard went through, and everything was fine, and you didn't hear too much about that location having problems anymore. Trump adds that such easy methods should be used all over the country, pointing to ongoing protests in Seattle as an example. And George Floyd's family in particular is disrespected when, almost unthinkably, President Trump seeks to rewrite their loved ones' last words at a public event celebrating the U.S. economy. Praising himself over a slightly better-than-expected jobs report on June 5th, the president calls it a great day for the recently murdered Floyd, even as protests over his death are still taking place in hundreds of cities and towns across America. Hopefully, George is looking down right now and saying, "This is a great thing that's happening for our country," the president muses. "This is a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody. This is a great day for everybody. This is a great, great day in terms of equality." Hours later, according to a New York Times report, Trump retweets a video of one of his most vocal supporters, far-right conservative commentator Candace Owens, calling Floyd not a good person. The Times further notes that on the day Trump touted Great Depression-like unemployment data as a great day for everybody and for the cause of equality, black unemployment, according to the very report Trump was then heralding, was on the rise. Some of the president's comments about race may remain permanently inexplicable as well as inexcusable. During an interview with Harris Faulkner, a black journalist from Fox News, Trump says of President Abraham Lincoln's actions while in office, which included issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, that it's always questionable, you know. In other words, the end result. Such a startling comment that Faulkner feels compelled to remind the sitting president that African Americans are free because of Lincoln's deeds. Trump subsequently declares that he will not even consider renaming U.S. military bases presently named after Confederate military officers, contending, seemingly without irony, that the names of these self-confessed, often slave-holding traitors to the Union are part of America's history of winning, victory, and freedom. Trump will further disrespect black Americans when, just hours after calling positive economic news and the deployment of the National Guard to disperse anti-police brutality protesters a great day for police brutality victim George Floyd, he retweets a post, according to New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker, quoting a conservative commentator saying of Floyd, "The fact that he has been held up as a martyr sickens me." The damage done by the president's retweet is compounded when he seeks to justify his earlier quotation of Walter Headley, a civil rights-era Miami police chief, the New York Times reports, was unconcerned with complaints of police brutality by contending that the phrase, "when the looting starts, the shooting starts," has two meanings. Per Trump, the infamous utterance can mean either, if there's looting, there's probably going to be shooting, or if there's looting, there's going to be shooting. The president, who falsely says the phrase has been used many times, insists that these are two very different meanings, and makes no apology for using the phrase on Twitter, despite the social media platform quickly determining that it glorifies violence and hiding it behind a warning message. Trump's methods and rhetoric during the anti-police brutality protests are considered so extreme that in extraordinary, even historic statements to the press, some of America's top military officials and veterans must distance themselves from the sentiments expressed publicly by their commander-in-chief. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, says of his appearance with Trump at St. John's immediately following the attack on peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square, "I should not have been there," and "it was a mistake." Milley further issues a letter to the Joint Force underscoring that both he and the whole of the U.S. military will stay true to their oath to the American people, an unsettling pre-election reminder that Trump has in the past demanded absolute loyalty from his subordinates, not loyalty to the country or to their sworn duties, but to him personally. Echoing Milley, retired four-star General Richard Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Republican President George W. Bush, calls Trump's actions in Lafayette Square not right, unconstitutional, and something that should not happen in America. As for the White House, it issues a statement more than a week after the attack on civilians in Lafayette Square, saying that the president has no regrets about his or his administration's actions. On June 11th, CNN reports on a coalition of several hundred West Point alumni from 6 decades of graduating classes who collectively served across 10 presidential administrations and have now decried in a public letter leaders who betray public faith through deceitful rhetoric, quibbling, or the appearance of unethical behavior, and eroding of public trust the letter appears to lay at the doorstep of both Trump and the military commanders who enabled him during the civil unrest following George Floyd's death. As the letter opines, we, a diverse group of West Point graduates, are concerned. We are concerned that fellow graduates serving in senior-level public positions are failing to uphold their oath of office and their commitment to duty, honor, country. Their actions threaten the credibility of an apolitical military. The letter echoes some of the sentiments found in a New York Times investigative report following the events in Lafayette Square. According to the Times, some members of the D.C. National Guard who participated in the government action in D.C. on June 1st say they feel demoralized and exhausted. They were so ashamed in taking part against the protests that they have kept it from family members. Expressing similar sentiments, hundreds of former senior U.S. officials, including at least 315 former ambassadors and 25 former generals, issue a public statement via the website Just Security entitled "The Strength of America's Apolitical Military," in which they announce that they are alarmed by calls from the president and some political leaders for the use of U.S. military personnel to end legitimate protests in cities and towns across America. Former Trump Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, long silent on the president whose administration he resigned from in December 2018, likewise makes an extraordinary public statement as the protests continue, writing in The Atlantic that Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. Mattis adds that the dismal state of America in mid-2020 is the consequence of 3 years without mature leadership. As to both the domestic and foreign policy of the Trump administration, there are questions that remain to be asked whose answers may be determinative of the election results in November 2020. For instance, why were nearly 7,500 Twitter accounts run by Turkish President Recep Erdogan's ruling party, accounts that tweeted a total of 37 million times, deemed violative of Twitter's terms of service? And what sort of election-related activities had these accounts executed or been planning prior to their deactivation? Likewise, after Twitter deactivated 1,000 Twitter accounts traced to the Chinese government in August 2019, how were more than 170,000 new accounts linked to Beijing able to appear almost immediately? And what election year activities had these accounts participated in before finally being removed in June 2020? Why, according to NPR, did hackers backed by China target Biden's campaign staff with phishing attacks in a manner similar to Russian cyber attacks on Clinton staffers during the 2016 presidential campaign? Were they seeking to honor Trump's public request in October 2019 for aid from the Chinese Communist Party? A request that mirrored a similar one Trump made to the Kremlin in 2016? These events raise a further question. Given his prior public support for Trump's efforts to seek dirt on Biden from the Chinese government, what subjects will Secretary of State Pompeo be privately discussing with Chinese government officials when he meets with them in Hawaii in the summer of 2020? Reports of an upcoming Pompeo-Beijing Pacific Summit come as OAN is boasting, according to a report in The Atlantic, that it has obtained several hours of secret recordings of then Vice President Biden's conversations with Ukrainian officials. The magazine notes that if these audio recordings indeed exist and are authentic, they are, according to 2 former U.S. ambassadors to Ukraine and a former ambassador to Russia, likely linked to pro-Russian interests in Ukraine and a Russian intelligence operation. That this material should be provided to OAN as Donald Trump Jr. is involved in an effort to purchase OAN raises the specter of the president's son again being involved, as he was in June 2016, in the receipt of valuable political interference offered to his father by hostile foreign interests. The Atlantic notes that Giuliani associate Andriy Derkach has already been linked to the release of several such Biden tapes, and that the person now claiming to have more tapes is OAN's Chanel Rion, the on-air personality who went with Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer, on his December trip to Ukraine, in part to find information on Biden to help Trump. In the past, some such evidence has been received by Giuliani allies from a website with Russian links, Nabu Leaks, which appears to be the 2020 version of WikiLeaks, but this time focused on smearing Joe Biden with bogus intelligence rather than Hillary Clinton. As revelations reach American media that the Trump family is linked to the Miss Ukraine Universe pageant through the now arrested Oleksandr Onyshenko and Trump friend Phil Ruffin's Ukrainian wife Oleksandra Nikolenko, a course of connection that includes Eric Trump serving as an unpaid judge for the pageant in Kyiv as far back as 2009, it remains unclear what may be revealed, perhaps even before the election, about the family's long-term ties to corruption and pro-Kremlin figures in Ukraine. Indeed, in a brief excerpt from John Bolton's book The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir released in mid-June, Trump's former top national security official reports that he is hard-pressed to identify any significant Trump decision during my tenure that wasn't driven by re-election calculations. A stunning revelation of systemic corruption that Bolton's publisher immediately augments by confirming that, per the book, Trump's Ukraine-like transgressions existed across the full range of his foreign policy. American voters cannot yet know whether the president's domestic transgressions, including systemic meddling in federal investigations involving his associates, will likewise continue unabated in the latter half of 2020, though the odds of a Michael Flynn pardon seem to rise nearly daily. Yet an independent review of DOJ's efforts to dismiss the Flynn case, authored by longtime mafia prosecutor and former federal judge John Gleeson, has now found that the DOJ campaign to invalidate Flynn's guilty plea is a gross abuse of prosecutorial power, corrupt, highly irregular, and riddled with inexplicable and elementary errors of law and fact. Moreover, it departs from positions that the government has taken in other cases, and therefore appears to be aimed solely at benefiting a political ally of the president. Whatever the result of the Onyshenko and Flynn cases, Trump's political team has certainly never been further from establishing any connection between the Bidens and corruption in Ukraine, and it is more probable than ever before that Trump and his agents' advancement of corrupt interests in Kyiv may yet become public. On June 14, 2020, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the entity whose acronym gives the website Nabu Leaks its name, reveals that it has intercepted a $6 million bribe intended to halt the investigation and prosecution of Mykola Zlochevsky, precisely the ambition would-be Trump and Giuliani political instrument Viktor Shokin, as well as Trump business associate Onyshenko, have in the past pursued. The revelation by Nabu of a bribery plot to achieve the ends of Trump's allies in Ukraine is accompanied, according to the Washington Post, by an unambiguous declaration by Nabu that it has ruled out involvement by Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden or his son Hunter, and an audit of the many outstanding case files looking into Burisma found no evidence of wrongdoing by the Bidens. Notably, given that a December 2016 video of a Trump transition event featured Ukrainian Fiscal Service Chief Roman Nazarov, Nabu also announces that, besides Zlochevsky, former Burisma employee Andriy Kitcha, and former tax official Olena Mazarenka, the former deputy head of Kyiv's tax office, Mykola Ilyashenko, has been implicated in the bribery scheme. While Nabu does not accuse Nazarov of wrongdoing, the fact that the former Fiscal Service chief's pending criminal case involves the alleged facilitation of a tax evasion scheme by Zlochevsky ally and Trump associate Onyshenko moves Trump and his clandestine political team one step closer to Ukraine's highest-profile ongoing corruption scandal. That the Senate Judiciary Committee votes along party lines on June 11th to subpoena 50 Obama administration officials as part of efforts to scrutinize the origins of the FBI's investigation into Russia and President Donald Trump's team confirms that pre-election attempts to advance Kremlin propaganda will emanate not just from pro-Trump media organs, but from the halls of Congress. When in early June, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence votes on a bipartisan basis, 8-7, with Senator Susan Collins joining the Democrats, to require presidential campaigns to report offers of foreign election influence to federal authorities, Senate Republicans prepare to remove the provision of the bill when it heads to the Senate floor, perhaps because public evidence suggests the Trump 2020 re-election campaign has already crossed the bill's ignominious reporting threshold. Nor is DOJ aloof from Trump's efforts to remake the history of the 2016 presidential election and tip the scales of the 2020 election. In late May, Dana Bente, the FBI's top lawyer and a participant in the successful prosecution of Michael Flynn, is asked to resign, per NBC News, by individuals at high levels of the Justice Department rather than FBI Director Christopher Wray. Notably, this attack on one of the federal law enforcement officers who investigated and prosecuted Flynn comes as DOJ is set to release, at the prompting of a federal lawsuit brought by the Electronic Privacy Information Center and BuzzFeed News reporter Jason Leopold, a new version of the Mueller report that contains previously redacted information from the Roger Stone investigation. A preview of the redacted material published by Politico reveals a heretofore obscure nexus between Stone, Flynn, and Trump's autocratic allies in Israel and Turkey, Netanyahu and Erdogan. During the same period in summer 2016 that Stone was seeking election aid from Israel and Turkey in the form of Clinton dirt, Michael Flynn's Flynn Intel Group, an entity with innumerable ties to Israeli and Turkish nationals, was allegedly discussing the possibility of kidnapping U.S.-dwelling Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen for $15 million and the gratitude of President Erdogan. This confluence of events raises the possibility of previously undisclosed pre-election Trump-Israel and Trump-Turkey collusion potentially involving criminal conduct, illicit payoffs, and intelligence intended, per the now public search warrant applications in the Stone case, as an anti-Clinton October surprise. Given Rudy Giuliani's history of cybersecurity and lobbying work connected to both the Israeli and Turkish governments, these developments may also presage the eventual discovery of a Ukraine-like conspiracy to defeat Clinton that matches the one that has apparently been unfolding against Biden since 2018. On June 4th, Trump, per the Washington Post, strongly hints that he will pardon Stone to ensure that his friend and advisor serves no federal prison time, tweeting to his more than 80 million followers that, as to the matter of a pre-sentence presidential pardon, Stone can sleep well at night. Politico reports the tweet is a promise that Stone will not be incarcerated for his actions in 2016, a pledge that the digital media outlet calls merely Trump's latest intervention in Stone's federal criminal case. The prospect of more such dramatic deviations from convention in 2020 and beyond may give Americans the sense that the guardrails for political campaigning have been permanently dismantled, along with so much else the nation long took for granted. Even far-right media organ Fox News, which by summer 2020 is nevertheless considered well to the left of OAN, seems no longer bound by even the most minuscule strictures within its sphere of activity, as the cable news outlet is caught, per a CNN report in June, publishing digitally altered and misleading images of the anti-police brutality protests that dovetail with Trump's campaign rhetoric by erroneously making Black Lives Matter protesters appear violent and dangerous. Meanwhile, irregularities in the governance of the nation seem to be appearing at an even faster clip. For instance, given that the president has in the past appeared to synchronize his administration's pandemic response to demands made by his mega-donors, it is deeply concerning that the Treasury Department has declared that it will not release to the public any information, not even recipient names, related to its distribution of $660 billion in pandemic relief funds for small businesses. At the local level, the ongoing pandemic continues to pose questions the president increasingly does not deign to acknowledge, such as why Texas, Florida, and California are continuing their reopening plans in mid-June 2020, despite, per the New York Times, seeing their highest daily tallies of new virus cases. Even as the Associated Press is reporting a rise in new COVID-19 cases in nearly half of U.S. states, and CNN is reporting that hospitalizations are increasing in at least a quarter of the states, the president has turned his attention away from the pandemic entirely, speaking of it in the past tense in a June Fox News interview, ceasing to hold press conferences about his administration's response to the crisis, refusing to hold the 2020 Republican National Convention in North Carolina because the state is insisting on adhering to CDC guidelines regarding social distancing, and meeting with Dr. Anthony Fauci so infrequently that by the beginning of June, it has been at least 2 weeks since the two men have spoken. Trump's inability or unwillingness to meet with the nation's top infectious disease expert stands in contrast to his decision to make the time to order U.S. military academy graduates back to West Point so he can give them a commencement address. The result, the AP reports, is that 17 graduating cadets asymptomatically infected with the novel coronavirus are reintroduced to the West Point community. It is, by all accounts, due in significant part to his handling of both the pandemic and the Floyd protests that by mid-June, Trump's average approval rating across a number of recent approval polls is at 41%. The question is what such polling might drive the president to do in late summer and early fall 2020. So it is not without reason that on June 10th, Senator Cory Booker, Democrat, New Jersey, indicates that he is concerned, much as Trump attorney Michael Cohen had expressed concern more than a year earlier, that Trump will refuse to concede if he loses the November 2020 election. Booker's concerns could only have been exacerbated by the Democratic primary in Georgia, a state long plagued by voting problems that its Republican legislators and executive branch officials seem consistently to exacerbate rather than alleviate, with CNN reporting hours-long lines to vote in many majority-minority precincts and concluding that the June 9th election in the Peach State constituted a meltdown of the voting system that has sparked widespread concerns about voter disenfranchisement. As many of the voting restrictions in Georgia and elsewhere that have caused widespread voter disenfranchisement were passed under the guise of anti-voter fraud efforts, it is particularly startling when just days before the Georgia primary, Slate reports, building off reporting from the Washington Post, that Trump appears to have committed felony voter fraud by trying to register to vote under an out-of-state address that is not, in fact, his legal residence. Shortly after the Slate report is published, HuffPost reveals that Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, cast Florida ballots in 2018 using her parents' address in Tampa, even though she lived in Washington, D.C. and held a New Jersey driver's license. Chara Torres Spelisi, a fellow at the Brennan Center and a law professor at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, tells the digital media outlet that if Florida is not really your primary residence, then it's inappropriate for you to be registered as a voter in Florida. This uncertainty and faithlessness at home are matched by uncertainty and faithlessness abroad. On June 5th, the Wall Street Journal reports that Trump will withdraw by September 2020 9,500 of the United States' 34,500 permanently assigned troops in Germany, a presidential edict, the newspaper opines, that will dramatically reshape the U.S. military posture in Europe and, according to former senior defense officials and lawmakers, further weaken a key alliance and empower U.S. adversaries. Moscow is likely to welcome the open display of differences between two key North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies. CNN military analyst Mark Hertling, a retired lieutenant general who formerly commanded the U.S. Army in Europe, calls Trump's announcement dangerous, short-sighted, and an additional gift to Russia that will further harm our alliances abroad. Meanwhile, in North Korea, according to the New York Times, 2 years after President Trump enthusiastically declared that there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea, classified assessments and experts conclude that the North's nuclear arsenal is far larger than it was in 2018, a revelation that signals the failure of Trump's maximum pressure campaign on North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, which had variously seen the president taunt the young autocrat on Twitter and receive letters from him that, per Trump, caused the two men to fall in love. The president's personal, administrative, and diplomatic recklessness during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the nation's ongoing civil unrest, an election season already marred by significant malfeasance by both Trump and his campaign, and a systemic weakening of democratic governments across the globe, sends America into the 2020 general election more concerned about its continued coherence as a nation than at any other time in modern American history. According to the Washington Post, Gail Helt, a former CIA analyst responsible for tracking developments in China and Southeast Asia, says the Trump administration's crackdowns on peaceful protests mirror what autocrats do and what happens in countries before a collapse. This in part explains why, by June 7th, 80% of Americans are telling NBC News Wall Street Journal pollsters that the country is out of control, and indicating by a 2-to-1 margin that they are more troubled by the actions of government agents in response to the George Floyd protests than the violence perpetrated by a small percentage of anti-police brutality protesters. This extraordinary state of affairs reminds us that the November 2020 presidential election may be not just a critical opportunity, but perhaps even one of the nation's last opportunities to right itself before substantially more damage, perhaps even irreversible damage, is done to America's rule of law and American democracy. Politico notes ominously that the president and his supporters have a range of mechanisms at their disposal, particularly amidst a pandemic, to restrict voting in person, change voting rules, hobble the postal service, or just intimidate or discourage voters, all of which could have an impact on election results. Proof of collusion, proof of conspiracy, and proof of corruption together form a 3-act play with a surprisingly conventional structure. The inciting incident of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, accompanied by clandestine pre-election Trump campaign collusion with America's enemies, the clash between Trump's already compromised pre-election foreign policy and the reality of rising geopolitical instability from Russia to the Middle East, and the inevitable denouement of an impeachment trial, a global pandemic worsened by Trump's incompetence and venality, and a historically ugly re-election campaign that Trump seeks to win by returning to the same sort of transnational collusion with which he launched his political career. And yet, just as the end of the Trump presidency, whether it comes in 2021 or 2025, will likely not be the end of Trump as an insidious presence at the heart of American life, the eventual end of Trump at some point in the future will not be the end of Trumpism. Whatever happens in fall 2020, Donald Trump's time in the Oval Office has been an inflection point in U.S. history that will still be worthy of historical consideration centuries hence. Future historians will surely marvel at the same incomprehensible disloyalties, tribal fidelities, and inchoate decompositions of our national character that we contemplate now. They will wonder, as we do, how so many of us let any of this happen. This trilogy of the Trump era, now over 2,400 pages in length with 12,000 citations to our era's very best journalism, is therefore only a first pass at the dystopian script of this period. It has been rendered, as in this author's view was necessary, via the lens of the curatorial journalism demanded by our present surfeit of high-quality digitized information. What comes next, however? whether a dramatic salvation or further flagrant degradation, is likely to unfold faster than any curation can adequately record. All that is left to say is this. Given the sacrifices that those Americans who came before us made to preserve our democracy, and that so many are making right now to carry us through the variously grand and esoteric trials of the Trump era, there is nothing we cannot dare to ensure that our descendants look back on our actions with admiration, and even, we hope, pride.